Hello, good evening and welcome to the TNT Show. I'm John Drummond, your host for the next 60 minutes. You know that the TNT Show and Indie Live are growing and we're delivering more exciting shows. You can watch the TNT Show, for example, on indielive.net. It's streamed out to YouTube, Facebook, TikTok and Twitter. Plus on YouTube, you can view all of our previous 160 odd shows. Now, many would say that the fourth estate in Scotland is mostly fourth rate. So if you're upset by media coverage of political events where journalism is junked in favour of stenography or rehashed news releases, or worse, when conjecture and hearsay replace facts, well, if you're looking for an alternative voice, you found it. We're here for you. You can be here for us, of course, if you support our crowdfunder. You'll see the details on the screen. Why not start with, say, a donation of £5? It's not a lot to ask, really, when you think of the enormous sums that BBC Scotland spends every year. Some people reckon it's close to £300 million. And you can see what the value for money you get from that expenditure. By the way, you're now experiencing BBC Scotland in full election mode, which means that unionist perspectives will dominate, with perhaps a grudging concession to any others. If there are any others who are able to put together an articulate and persuasive case, it's highly likely they'll receive fewer and fewer invitations. It's been another great day for British democracy. The impression you get when you watch the political newscasts is that it's pretty much a stitch-up and that the Labour Party is going to win by a landslide, which is probably true, by the way. The issues will come thereafter, I suspect. And I do hope that the coverage that is afforded to all parties is as comprehensive as possible. And again, I would repeat the invitation to Alaba MSP Ash Regan to come on the show. I've had a number of people contact us saying, look, could Ash please come on the show? And I'll tell you what I said to them. By all means, we've asked, and I'm asking again tonight. So it's an open invitation. Tonight we'll be talking to a special guest, Socialist Richie Venton. He'll be discussing what's happening in Scotland, politics, and much else besides. And he'll be taking your questions live. So there's still time to get a question, and you'll see the details on the screen. As you know, TNT stands for Nation Talk. So in many respects, this is your opportunity, your show in a sense. We're live and we're free. So no license, no problem. Now, to our guest tonight, thanks for joining us. Richie, how are you?
I'm fine, thanks, John, and thanks for the invitation. We don't always get a platform for socialism.
It's probably one of these rare occasions, Richie. Where,
yes. Yeah.
So where are you speaking to us from tonight?
I'm in Glasgow. That's where I've lived for, 30 years now. Originally Northern Ireland, then I lived in Liverpool for quite a while and organised the Socialist States that beat Maggie Thatcher, I'm proud to say.
All right. Liverpool is a place, I think the lawyer's term is sui generis, one of its own kind, isn't it? I mean, you don't see too many Liverpools around the place.
No, there needs to be more Liverpools in the sense of a working class that are prepared to be rebellious and stand up against the authorities. I mean, for example, the people of Liverpool generally regard themselves as almost like a separate nation. They take umbrage if you suggest that they're English, most of them, and they're quite ready to stand up. And of course, they suffered a lot for that defiant stance by the fact that Thatcher and her government of the 80s and her successors applied what they called managed decline. I merely say deliberately smashing jobs and so on. But people fought back.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? So you are a founding member of the SSP, is that right?
That's right. I was one of the organisers when the Scottish Socialist Party was established in 1998, 25 long years ago.
Yes.
And I'm the National Trade Union organiser since.
My really only connection with the SSP, I think, was it Alan McCombs, I think? I put together the first independence convention.
Oh, yeah.
And you had representation from all the parties.
That's right.
Except the Tories and Labour, I think. And of course, Lib Dems sort of flirted a little bit, but decided it was too rich for their constitution.
Yeah, Yeah.
But we had representation, SNP, SSP, right across the board. We had lots of people come along and turn up and talk and stuff like that. And it was all great fun. But these things are difficult to accomplish over a long period of time unless there is some specific turning point, as it were, electorally. Otherwise, they tend to become talking shops, which is always a trouble. I mean, I've formed a number of different groups of this nature, and it's always a challenge. It's never as straightforward as it looks. Everyone from outside says, well, if you have a concern, a grievance or whatever, simple, all you do is get together with other folks who share the same view, and then eventually you'll get heard. Well, it's not quite as straightforward as that.
No, unfortunately not. And I mean, I suppose, John, what you're driving at is that when there's a clear target or purpose to joint campaign, and then it's simpler relatively. Like, for example, during the build-up to the 2014 referendum, the Scottish Socialist Party actively and gladly and quite energetically acted as the socialist wing of the Yes movement, both conducting their own socialist campaign for an independent socialist Scotland, but also alongside people of other parties and none, demanding, number one, the right to self-determination, but specifically independence as a means to an end, because as a party, our view is that the Scottish people should have the right to independence, to escape the clutches of a Tory government that has never had a majority vote since 1955 in Scotland.
That's true.
And yet we've had plenty of Tory governments. Let
me put a slightly fundamental question to you, Richie.
Okay.
It troubles me, and I think it might trouble others too. It's the fact that that one has to demand the right to self-determination. Surely that's a given. That self-determination is built into the UN Charter. The bigger question is why it's not being exercised.
Well, precisely, it should be a given. It's a fundamental democratic right, but a right that's denied in the case of Scotland until such time as there's a mass movement to force it.
If you go to the person who is preventing, it's very unlikely that they will say, okay, thank you for approaching me, I will stop preventing you. The most likely thing they're going to say is, well, no, I don't agree with you. And that's the end of the story. I think that's a concern that some people have when they listen to the SNP, for example, and say, look, they keep treading the same path, which is we're going to ask somebody else for an opportunity to have a say.
Well, that's right. I mean, the SSP has always said that what the first task is to convince an overwhelming majority, which specifically would be the working class, given that's the big majority of the population, that independence is a worthwhile mission, that it'll mean a huge change to their lifestyles. I mean,
do you think you really need a big majority, Richie? I mean, I'm thinking about historical precedents here now. And when I look at the historical precedents, there were very few that had a huge majority. I mean, if you take the United States, I mean, they possibly didn't have a majority at all and went ahead anyway. Now, it helps enormously if the other side keep making shocking mistakes, as happened in the case of 1776 and thereafter. But even without that, one gets the impression that the United States would have been a very, very difficult bunch of people to govern without significant change. And even when then eventually when the UK government came back and said, I'll tell you what, we'll offer you a change, we'll offer you devolution, they said, well, that's too late, sorry.
Well, I suppose that both, whether it be even the limited concession of devolution back in the 90s or outright independence for Scotland, focusing on this country, then whilst I think it's an inbuilt democratic right and should be, it has been denied by the powers that are in charge, particularly at a UK capitalist state level. And the only way of overcoming that, I think, is to conduct a campaign that convinces the vast majority of people in Scotland, number one, that it's a mission to be worthwhile pursuing because it's going to mean better wages, better workplace rights, better health service, public ownership of wealth, and all those other measures of socialist change, and then mobilise a movement in whatever form is necessary including, of course, demonstrations, protests, occupations of buildings if necessary in the future, and whatever else it takes to actually engage with the powers that be and defeat them. I mean, I know I mentioned earlier I used to be in Liverpool. Well, on a different scale, at a city level, we organised mass movements through public meetings, demonstrations, one-day generous strikes in the region, demonstrations of 50, 60,000 in a city that's smaller than Glasgow. That's what defeated Maggie Thatcher's government in 1984, because they could not tolerate any more organised collective rebellion from working class people. And I think if you want to draw that parallel, in the case of Scotland, the best and surest route towards getting what should be our democratic right of independence is to put a vision that convinces people it's worth engaging in such mass struggle. It's not going to be done by pleas to the Supreme Court, as we warned in advance, or any other legalistic shenanigans. It's going to require, to use an old phrase, people power, organised to change things. And to do that, to get that into action, that's where, the SSP quite distinctly has said over the years, you have to convince people there's not going to be just a continuation, a seamless change from, the Union Jack to the Saltire and nothing else changes. I don't want to swap flags. I want to swap systems. Mm-hmm. And I think most working class people want radical change to their living conditions. And, for example, just the one example I'll give is that in 2014, on the streets, we campaigned around the slogan of Vote Yes for, at that time, a £9 Scottish minimum wage, and used that as an opener to convince people that it's material change to their conditions we're arguing about, not just constitutional niceties. And it convinced loads of people who otherwise were not convinced of the leap into the dark, as they saw it. Yeah. And obviously £9 then is £15 an hour now. But you know what I mean? It's the method.
Let me put something to you, Richie. That's very eloquent. There is an old saying that revolutions and major change don't happen when the workers march, but when the lawyers do. What's your reaction to that?
I don't recall a great history of the lawyers marching. Obviously, there's countries where lawyers have marched. I'm being facetious. I think sometimes maybe even you get lawyers in revolt, like in, was it Italy? There was revolts of the lawyers, and at one stage, maybe even, dare I say, in places like Israel, but against the government at one point. But I think in the end, it's the organised working class that have the power to change society.
Yeah, I think
lawyers tag along and help us. That's great.
Yeah, I think the point that was being made is that the powers that be usually find some mechanisms for arranging things around the working class, but find it hugely difficult to manipulate to the same degree the middle class. I think that was what that phrase was about.
Right.
Because people pointed to the French Revolution and said, look, it all changed once the lawyers took to the streets.
Yeah.
Because that's the signal that the system has just completely failed.
That's true. I would say that actually in my own very short living experience, of course, an example of how the process, I think, is that once the working class move into action, you quite often get the sympathy of a big section of the middle class. In the case of the Liverpool struggle, to not harp on about it, we had even police officers who were sympathetic to the struggle of the Socialist Council. We had priests and ministers who were supporting the houses, service improvements and so on, and the battle that involved against the Thatcher government that was trying to rob us of, had robbed the city of £500 million, and we were demanding back 30 million to balance the books, which incidentally I think is what the councils in this country should be doing. Obviously, we're not prepared to accept Tory austerity from Westminster or Labour austerity for Westminster, as it will become in a month, and then passed down through Holyrood meekly and spinelessly, in my opinion. We're not prepared to accept that. We're going to stand up and demand the money back to balance the books and save jobs and services. So you get a lot of support from the kind of middle layers of society when there's a big movement of the working class, I think.
Talking about people cooperating, The leader of the SNP said he's not going to cooperate with Alaba. What's the position of the SSP? Would it support the SNP at this election, or would you say that that's not something we want to do?
No, we've got very limited financial abilities to conduct an election campaign, especially when it's the rigged system of Westminster. Rigged because you have to be one of the money bags to be able to put up a serious widespread challenge. So we've actually, in the end, limited ourselves to 2 seats, Rutherglen and Glasgow East. Standing candidates, Liam McLaughlin and Bill Bonner, who are pledged, like our party always does, to live on the average wage of a worker, socialist MPs on a worker's wage to stay in touch. So we advocate our own vote, but we don't call for a vote for another party because we wouldn't be prepared to be compromised by the measures that those other parties have carried out already or will in the future.
Sure.
You know, the cuts, for example, that have been handed down by whether it be Labour or SNP councils, for instance, and the savage austerity that I think Labour's going to mete out to people, with the fact that, you know, the studies show there's about £19 billion of cuts looming in the public sector under a Labour government, equivalent to, I'll not give all the figures, but 800,000 trainee nurses and over 580 probationary teachers and so on, and junior doctors of a similar scale. And I mean, I think that's what's looming towards us. So there's no way we would consider calling for a vote for what I regard as the Tory Labour Party.
Yeah.
You know, Sunak and Starmer are 2 men fighting to become the next Tory Prime Minister. To see which of them becomes that.
Yeah, it's like I mean, when they go on about there's no money, it always seems to me it's a bit like watching 2 bald men fight over a comb.
Yes, indeed.
What's the point?
Yes.
Let me put a different question to you, just very briefly. What's your position on the EU? Are you for rejoining it, or are you happy not to be part of it?
Well, during the Brexit referendum, for shorthand to call it that, then we debated and discussed and pointed out, number one, that the EU is essentially a capitalist club which is dominated by the multinationals in Europe, anti-nationalisation, pro-privatisation, not a friend of the worker. However, the other choice at the time was a really vicious, xenophobic right-wing agenda. Farage, Johnson, various people like that, Cameron, of course. And we argued that openly, we said, vote to remain as the lesser of 2 evils.
Yeah.
I mean, we're plain speaking about, we didn't dodge the issue. We're not fans of the European Union as constituted. But I'd say that what we need to do is fight for Scottish independence, win that, and then have a sensible discussion about our relationships to Europe. And my ultimate aim, I have to say, would be some kind of alliance or confederation of socialist democracies across Europe, as opposed to the European Union, which, like I said, is just a capitalist club that's not here to favour workers. It'll become worse even, by the way, as you can work out for yourself, John, with the move to the right in governments on the continent that's currently taking place. Because the EU, in many ways, is a conglomeration of those different forces.
Yeah, but a lot of those moves to the right, just to be clear, are within national governments. They're not necessarily. And you could argue that the EU is exercising some sort of damping effect on that, because getting enough right-wingers to control the European Parliament would be a big ask. However, getting control of the Dutch Parliament was relatively straightforward. I mean, the right wing made the appeal, and we know what happened from that point onwards. The Dutch, who are the most tolerant people in the world, in my experience, have elected a bunch of guys that, frankly, unspeakable. But that's what happened. That's what happens with if you posit a particular set of circumstances to the electorate and just convince them that their choices are limited to the extremes, as it were. I mean,
on that, if I can just chip in, then I think that move to the right in national governments. I know it's not uniform, but we'll talk broad terms. Holland's an example, of course. Then I think that move to the far right is a product of the utter failure and actually betrayal of people's expectations and conditions by a mixture of traditionally conservative parties and social democracy, the equivalent of the Labour Party in this country, who have let down working class people in particular, who then, in the despair of extreme poverty, are more prey to the false prophets of the far right.
I mean, it's interesting you say that. I mean, I've got some experience of Spain.
Yeah.
And my experience of Spain is this: the health service is fantastically better than the UK. People who fall ill and go to hospital, there are no ambulances lined up around the block. They get seen by triage people within 5 or 10 minutes. And if necessary, a crash team are available to help them. It's a far, far better service than anywhere in the UK. And the Spanish health service is regarded as being the third best in the world. Right. Also, the place is clean. There are people who clean up on Sundays. The difference is that they've never had a Thatcher. And right now they have a socialist government, perhaps not the type of socialism that you would recognise, Richie, but they carry the label anyway. And they're hedged about with challenges. I mean, they're having to do deals with the good folks in Catalonia there, and some of the not so good folks in Catalonia as well. And they want to rig things in Catalonia, and I understand that. That's the way these things work, realpolitik. But it's a somewhat neat example of what happens to a country that hasn't gone through a period of enforced austerity. That the people feel that they are connected to the services that are being provided for them.
Absolutely, and it's probably a very timely comment you've made there, because at the weekend there we celebrated as a party. I mean, we held an event to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the miners' strike in Britain. Yesterday was the 40th anniversary of the Battle of Orgreave, when mindless violence was unleashed by Thatcher's government through the police on horseback and truncheons and military formations, so on, against striking miners and their allies in the trade union movement, so in Orgreave, Yorkshire. But the point I'm making is that I don't know of an equivalent of such a showdown between the fundamental classes in society as the miners' strike was, a civil war without guns, as somebody once called it, and end up in defeat. The defeat of the miners, I think, was a fundamental turning point in Britain, and it ushered in a whole despair amongst many people, and also the tops of the trade unions and the Labour Party in particular preached the gospel of new realism. You have to accept your lot. Don't get uppity with the ideas you can combine and fight back, because look, the miners were defeated. And it ushered in a whole period of kind of individualism and undermined the collectivism of the working class, which has only, I think, begun to recover partially over the last couple of years in the wave of strikes that took place, which were the biggest since 1989, actually. And I think, therefore, that ties in with what you're saying about even things like the health service, because we've got the obnoxious reality of the Labour leadership saying that when or if they're elected, they'll privatise far more of the British health service than even Tony Blair did. And he made a bloody good job of privatising chunks of it.
Well,
and you'll have this
the thing about
situation where...
I think that's true. The thing about the health service is it's such a ripe fruit to privatise. I've got friends in the United States, and I'm sure you're familiar with this too. Is that if you can't pay, then you're removed from hospital, and in some cases just dumped at a street corner. And you've got to look after yourself because you didn't take out the insurance. And my experience of the States was, and this is many years ago, by the way, having my hair cut, and I said to the barber, I said, "How's business?" He said, "It's very good," he said. But it's hard to do well here. I said, "Why, if you're earning a decent income?" He said, "Well, because I'm still paying off my father's health bill." His father's health bill.
Yes.
Because his father had a chronic condition. And he said, of course, I can't get insurance for my kids. And I thought, oh boy, what a nightmare. And you know, that's what happens, it seems to me, if you go down this route, perhaps, of saying, look, and I heard somebody from the Labour Party tonight saying, well, we're not going to privatise everything, but if there's a bed available in a private facility, then of course what we'll do is we'll pay that facility for use of the bed. Well, see, that's the short end of the stick. As soon as you acknowledge that there's a separate system, then you're
Well,
up.
actually, during COVID, they did that. They forked out, I can't remember the figures in my head, but they forked out billions of pounds to the private sector hospitals just to hire the beds for the COVID patients for the National Health Service. And Wes Streeting, who's the Labour future, health secretary, he has made plain, he's used expressions like he's prepared to go far further than Tony Blair in terms of privatisation of the health service. And it would be, as you said, we go down the American road where if you collapse, they don't feel your pulse, they feel your wallet to see whether or not you're going to be treated. Yeah. And I think it's a really dangerous route that's been travelled. And already we've seen the way that funds have been stolen from the National Health Service by all these PFI schemes that Labour, and I have to say the SNP under a different acronym, carried out. One simple example, Wishaw General Hospital cost £100 million to build, but you have to repay $813 million back to the consortia of moneylenders, banks and people in Australia and God knows where, big companies. And Labour's talking about ushering in sections of the health service to the likes of American multinational companies to provide. And I think that's one of the reasons we have to be prepared for almighty showdowns with what will be a Labour government. I mean, that's all the trends and opinion polls indicate that. We have to be prepared to organise against that. And that's what the Scottish Socialist Party's trying to, on a modest scale, do during this election, to warn people what's coming down the track. Like we did in 1997, by the way, towards Blair. Most people wouldn't listen at the time.
No,
I think there's more listen this time, maybe, because the were offered nothing.
It must be very hard for you because you presumably don't get a lot of cover and you have to produce your own leaflets, I assume, and you have to traipse around the doors. And versus that, you've got the power of the media and you've got the power of the internet.
Yeah.
And that's colossal.
Yes.
I mean, I often wonder about, I know there's not many options if you're strapped for cash, but the reality is that these are formidable promotion machines. The broadcast media coupled with social media. I mean, I know that during the last American election, but one, when Trump, I think, beat Hillary Clinton, I mean, people next door to each other on the same street were getting different ads from Trump.
Yeah, that's
either
right.
in favor or opposed to gun control.
Yeah.
Now that's the power. I mean, that takes bucks. That takes a lot of money. But then again, it was used tellingly in Brexit. People were getting the same ads. Different people were getting ads that responded to their social media coverage, and that's uncontrolled. In other words, there's no budget on that, as there is on other electoral expenses.
That's right. And I mean, the mainstream parties, the establishment parties, they spend an absolute fortune on social media, like you're describing, John, targeting people and so on. What we try to rely on, and all we can do, is primarily to have the leaflets on the streets, street campaigning, cover workplaces and explain things. And for example, when we meet people and say, we're for abolition of all zero contracts, not these weasel words from Labour about only getting rid of the exploitative ones when they're all exploitative. I pioneered the policy of scrap all zero contracts entirely and introduce a legal entitlement to a minimum 16-hour week for every worker that wants it. Now, I won that as the policy of my own union, OSDO, at the 2018 National Conference, which then in turn became the Scottish TUC policy, and weirdly became the policy of the Labour Party through OSDO. But they're just ripping that up without a care, where they're saying, "Oh, we'll just get rid of some of them."
Yeah, I know that's sophistry. What is the relationship between the trade union movement, would you say, and the Labour Party? I mean, there must be, not just people like yourself. There must be others who are looking at that and must be thinking, "What the heck is going on here?"
I mean, I think there's increased strains and movements towards divorce between the unions and the Labour Party. But the problem is there's leaders who sometimes make absolutely legitimate criticism of the Labour leadership and the fact they're not prepared to repeal all the anti-union laws brought in by the Tories, or they're not prepared to carry out the policy of the trade union movement for a £15 minimum wage, which the SSP pioneered, rising with inflation, of course. They're not prepared to protect public services from privatisation, quite the opposite. And yet they criticise Labour for those things, but continue to hand over union members hard-earned cash in donations to the Labour Party. And I don't think that's good enough. I mean, I think there should be a democratisation of what's referred to as the political fund in the trade unions, where workers would have the democratic choice of which pro-trade union party their political fund could be given to. Right now, Labour is a monopoly. But the fact that, for instance, the RMT union, the Railway Maritime Union, disaffiliated from the Labour Party, or actually were expelled from the Labour Party for affiliating to the Scottish Socialist Party, or the fact that the Bakers Union has disaffiliated from Labour about, I think it's 2 years ago, I think it's a straw in the wind. Under a Labour government, I can see an awful lot more of that, because there's public sector workers who understand firsthand from Labour councils what it's like. They've been hammered, jobs, workload, privatisation by another name, etc. Or they understand it from a British level where Labour comes into power. And I think we'll see more and more trade unionists saying, enough's enough. We've given money to this party because it was the trade unions and socialists who founded the Labour Party, but that's 120 years ago. It's a completely different beast now. It's another capitalist party now, no pretense.
Let me tell you another exposure that process has. If the trade union can decide where its members' political contributions go, then it leaves you wide open to what happened in 1930s Germany.
Yeah.
When a totalitarian regime took over, the trade unions found that they were funding the Nazi party.
Yeah.
Because they just passed a law that says you can only support one party.
Yeah.
So it's a danger. If you leave it to the individual to decide, then of course you have a different arrangement there.
Yeah.
Because the individual may exercise their choice not to have the money given to any political party. Who knows? But anyway, it just seemed to me.
I mean, as far back as January 1999, soon after we set up the Scottish Socialist Party, I initiated a campaign inside the unions called "Make the Break," meaning make the break from Labour, and inverted the old proverb by saying, "Why feed the hand that bites you? Why give money to the Labour Party that bites you, so to speak?"
Yeah.
And it got a lot of support. And I think that day will come again when, particularly when Labour's in office, they can pretend all sorts of things when they're in opposition. They can pretend to be the workers' friend. But, I mean, in Scotland, they're led by a man, Anas Sarwar. I don't want to make it personal, but his family own a warehouse where for many years they refused to even allow our union to recruit workers into the union, and then subsequently refused negotiating rights for quite a while. So if that's the workers' friend, then God help us. The fact is that the Labour Party have deserted any pretense of being the party of the working class. And the fact that Rachel Reeves said yesterday or the day before that she hoped that the bankers noticed that their fingerprints were all over Labour's manifesto. I mean, that says it all.
Yeah,
She's cuddling up to big business, as we know. Their fingerprints are all over it, and the hand of the working class is nowhere to be seen in their manifesto.
I think that's reiterates essentially my concern about what's going to happen 2-3 years from now when Labour fail. Is it will create a vacuum, and it could be filled by who knows what might fill it, but it won't be good, I should imagine. I want to ask you a question. I'm not sure I fully understand the nature of the question, but I'll give it to you anyway.
Okay.
The question is, what is the SSP's policy on the AES, the actually existing socialist states of China, Cuba, Laos, Vietnam, and DPRK?
Right.
Off you
Well,
go.
there are differences between the different states, because to call was Russia mentioned in that? I don't know if it was on the list. No. Okay. I mean, Russia's a gangster capitalist state, and I think in the case of China, that in reality, that's almost like a state capitalist body, where what used to be state-owned sometimes still is, but it's a new capitalist class that's arisen through the so-called Chinese Communist Party. And therefore, we have never seen that as a model of the socialist Scotland that we're campaigning for, because there's a lack of democracy for a start off.
Yeah, I know. I've been to China. What about Cuba? Because I've been to Cuba as well. What would you think about Cuba?
Cuba's a bit different. I think it's definitely suffering the prolonged consequences of the embargo from American imperialism, and therefore there's been retreats on some of what the regime had previously done. But in broad terms, the fact that under state ownership, then they produced an enormously healthy health service, exported doctors to other countries and so on, even though it's a very impoverished island in terms of its fundamental economy. I mean, I think I wouldn't hold it up again as the exact model of socialism, because its circumstances are different to those of Scotland. Scotland's got a very advanced economy.
Yeah.
If it was to be the case we went socialist tomorrow, then there's a very, very developed, educated working class.
This is true.
And provided with workers' control and management, it'd be a more flourishing democracy than Cuba certainly has afforded.
What about Vietnam?
I don't see that as much more than, as far, I've not kept up with the developments, I'll be honest, but I think it's much more like the traditional Stalinist state from my knowledge of it, but I might be out of date.
Yeah, I've been to Vietnam, and my impression was it was awfully like the way you described China. In other words, when you when you travel south from Hanoi, I mean, I lost count the number of semiconductor factories.
Yeah,
and these were established because the wage rates were lower than they are in other Southeast Asian countries. And as for the South, it's sort of like parts of China. I mean, you've got most of the population, I think it'd be fair to say, is under 25. And when I look at the West and compare what's happening in the Southeast Asia, it looks like no contest. It looks like a heavyweight against a flyweight, I have to say. But anyway, not necessarily socialist, I have to say. I didn't see much socialism there, but who knows?
No, I mean, it starts from a very difficult premise or foundation anyway, that there were all pretty economically backward countries at the time that the systems changed. And it was a huge leap forward, to pardon the phrase, sounds a bit like Chairman Mao, but it was a huge leap forward for the Chinese people when there was the overthrow of the previous, feudal lords and so on, and it became a planned economy. But there was limitations to that, because it never had a democratic system of how it was organized and run. It was never, if you want to call it that, a workers' democracy from day one. And I think now what it's transformed into is more like a kind of state capitalism, where the elite that are at the tops of the misnamed Communist Party of China are the ones that rule the roost. But the planning, I suppose, on the other hand, in a distorted way, indicates the advantages of economic planning if you had it combined with democracy. If you had elected boards of management in every institution, college, workplace, whatever, then that combined with planning would be a big leap forward in Scotland.
Yeah, that my experience of China was much like that. It's. I mean, the difference between China and the United States, for example, even though many of the processes are similar in some respects, is this long-term view, which doesn't occur
Yeah.
in the West. I'm reminded of that old story about the Chinese ambassador was being welcomed to France by de Gaulle. And as a conversation starter, de Gaulle said, "What did you think of the French Revolution?" And he said, "Well, it's too early to tell."
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that sort of sums up China in many respects. The West thinks about next month, maybe next year, maybe next 10 years. The Chinese think in centuries. Because that's what the history has said to them. If you don't think in centuries, right, then you'll suffer. And I think that's
well, I suppose they're learning in that respect from, at least for an episode in history, the British Empire.
Mm-hmm.
The ruling class of Britain used to think in terms of centuries or as a minimum decades, but then it became short-termism, a fast buck, who can make the quickest profits, to hell with the consequences. And we saw, for example, even if you only just go back as far as the 1980s with Thatcher in power, we saw the way in which there was a grand theft of wages as a share of wealth, as a share of GDP in Britain, with the result that the usual contradiction of capitalism, where workers cannot spend enough to then make profits for the capitalist producers. So what did they do? They gave us a huge outburst of credit extension. I mean, for years I used to ask for a loan. I was always low income and I could never get one. The bank would tell me to bugger off. But then I started being bombarded with all these offers of loans, which thankfully I didn't fall for. But that was an indication that they tried to compensate for wage theft, for the reduction of wages as a share of wealth, with the extension of credit, which ultimately led to the crash of 2008, because people could no longer afford to pay back what they borrowed, because credit becomes debt.
They're just a way of representing the same thing. I mean, that's so when politicians say the national debt has gone up, that's not debt, that's credit that we give to ourselves. I mean, it's a misterminology, a misnomer.
That's right.
And there's loads of terrific people, we've had them on the show, who will explain that in detail, but that's the reality of it. So when the Labour Party says, we have to have austerity because we have no money, that's just
it's a nonsense. It's actually Thatcherite in every respect, both its consequences, but the philosophy behind it is this idea that the economy in any state is like a household budget. That's nonsense.
It is not.
A household has a limited income, and there's not very much you can do about that unless you organise as a worker to increase your wages through your union or whatever. But an economy has the opportunity to decide to spend, for example, to introduce a system of free public transport in Scotland, which we advocate, or to build 100,000 council houses to the highest environmental standards at affordable rent, to tackle the housing emergency, and to cut poverty and pollution with measures like free public transport for all ages on buses, trains, ferries, subways. And they might say, well, how would you pay for that? Well, in the short term, I could explain how you could pay for it easily by, for example, using the £400 million that privatised bus companies get off the Scottish government in subsidies this year alone. Use that instead of fattening the profits of McGill's and Stagecoach and First Bus. Instead of doing that, how about using that to partially fund free travel for everybody that would reduce car usage, pollution, asthma, cancers, global warming and so on, improve lives all around, combat poverty and pollution. But you could use money. You could print money if you need it as a government. That's the heart of it.
Well, that's what happened during COVID.
Yeah,
and that's
exactly.
what happened during the Second World War, and that's what happened with the health service. I mean, how did you pay off all these doctors, etc.? This is a perfect opportunity to mention your book, because it actually talks about climate change versus other change. There it's there, and it's obscured on my screen, but I think it says socialist change, not climate. There we are. Socialist change, not climate change. And so if anyone wants to know more about what you've been talking about tonight, Richie, how can they get a copy of your book?
Well, if they look up the Scottish Socialist Party website, there's a section where mentions publications.
Okay.
Or they can look up my Facebook page and message me, whatever they want. And it's £5. It's well worth it. I wrote it a couple of weeks prior to COP26 in Glasgow to put forward this idea that we need a socialist Green New Deal consists of public ownership of energy to rapidly transition to green production, but led by workers, a workers-led transition, not treating them as the miners suffered in the 1980s, and proved through research that that one measure in terms of public ownership of energy and green energy production could produce 70,000 new green jobs, skilled jobs, unionised jobs in Scotland alone. And likewise, free public transport, like I mentioned there, could produce as a minimum 60,000 jobs over 10 years, the first 35,000 over 2 years, to create a network of reliable, green-powered, integrated public transport systems to combat the overuse of cars.
And people can get the book and learn more about that. What would you say to people, Richie, who might say, oh, I'm concerned there might be a flight of capital from any left-wing Scottish government, independent government? What would you say to those folks?
Well, I would say, number one, if it came to multinationals that had physical factories or whatever, productive units in Scotland, they can't just uplift the machinery and fly away. But when it comes to flight of capital, then number one, we shouldn't be relying on rattling a begging bowl with briberies in the bowl towards multinationals for inward investment. I think it should be an organised, if you want to call it that, a planned economy, a democratically planned economy where there's public ownership of all the major sectors like transport, energy, construction, major industries, the utilities and so on, and banking. And if you had that, you could begin to democratically plan according to need and not rely on the whims of multinationals that have a whole long and dirty history of coming in, grabbing all sorts of, regional development grants and whatever else they might be called, low taxation, tax holidays and so on. And then when they've made their profits, up sticks and go away to a cheaper labour economy elsewhere. Volvo did it, Motorola did it, umpteen others did it from Scotland. And so I think it's a case more of saying we need organised public ownership with democratic involvement of the workforces and the wider community and the government in deciding what's produced and what services are priorities and what products are most needed, and have a democratic socialist plan, if you want to call that for shorthand, instead of reliance on multinationals that have absolutely no loyalty to anybody apart from their own shareholders.
What would you say, Richie, to people who said, well, we've seen a planned economy at work. That was in Stalinist Russia, and we don't much like the look of that.
Well, the difference being that was number one, the planned economy there did vastly develop society for a number of decades. There's no denying that compared to capitalist rule in Russia or the Soviet Union, as it became for a time, prior to the Russian Revolution. But the other side of it is that I was one of those who never saw that as a ready existing model of socialism. I never saw that as the socialist model for anywhere else, and argued that there needed to be fundamental political change to make it democratic, because it wasn't. It was a ruthless dictatorship, a one-party dictatorship. Now, it was circumstances that partly led to that. The invasion of the new Russian state, 1917 onwards, by people like Winston Churchill and his troops. He led the charge to try and overthrow their government that workers and peasants had established. So British imperialism played its part in creating Stalinism. We shouldn't let them off the hook that way. But the main point I would make to bring it up to date is that we don't see what took place in the likes of Stalinist Russia as the model of what we're talking about. Not at all. We're talking about the idea that, for example, you should have, just working upwards, you should have workers' control of health and safety through elected health and safety representatives, union reps, instead of corners being cut endangering lives by senior managers that want to cut costs. We should have workers' control of day-to-day decisions in a workplace. We should have democratically elected boards of management made up of a mixture of union representatives in that industry or service or workforce and the wider community and the elected government in some form without having a blueprint. That would mean you could have the needs of society as a whole looked after, but rooted in the interests of the working class, with a working class majority in those boards. Right now, what you've got is a remote set of incredibly, grotesquely overpaid chief executives who get something like, I think the last figure I read was 162 times the average worker's wage, not the lowest worker's wage. And they're utterly remote from workers' interests. So instead of that dictatorship of capital, which we have now, we want working class socialist democracy. So it'd be public ownership with democracy. That's the huge difference compared to the example of Stalinist Russia.
So when you look around the world, Richie, are there any models out there of countries that you would say, hey, though they may not conform precisely to what you would like to see happen, but they're an approximation perhaps? Is there any country or state that you would point to?
I don't think I could, unfortunately, John. I don't think there's anywhere you could say was exactly or even approximately what we're aiming at as a vision. There's places where obviously they've, even under capitalism, it's a bit better than it is in this country. Like, for example, in countries where they tax the rich a damn sight more than here. And as a result, there's a more equal society, and it's been proven by God knows how many studies that greater equality leads to greater happiness, less social violence, and so on. But there's nowhere that I would hold up as even an approximation of exactly what we're after. I mean, what we're driving towards is Scotland, an independent social Scotland, whereby you would, and then in turn, by the way, it wouldn't be an isolationist Scotland. It'd be to reach out to neighbours, nearest neighbours and beyond, to combine with the people of England, Wales, Ireland, Europe, worldwide, as an agency of peace, not war, as an agency of cooperation, not vicious competition that drives people to the bottom, in the race to the bottom, and would act as a beacon for other workers and young people and middle-class people even to fight for similar in other countries, and then hopefully establish some kind of federations or alliances, or what you'd like to call it, of socialist democracies, like I said, in different states. But a socialist Scotland whereby the fabulous wealth of the country is pooled and used for the benefit of the people and not of the profiteers, to put in simple, plain language. So that requires public ownership. It requires ownership. In other words, you can't, the old adage that I'm sure you know, that you can't plan what you don't control, and you cannot control what you don't own. Yeah. So unless we have public ownership, you can't control and therefore plan to produce 100,000 council houses or green energy jobs or transport workers' jobs or whatever you want to give as an example, and transform the economy into a much more equalised one where the rich pay their way and gradually it close the gap. I mean, one of the policies that we have as well, we argue for a £15 minimum wage, but we also argue for a legal maximum income. Now, when we established this as a policy, I said, and I still say, it's actually in some respects far too generous to the rich, because what we've said is that the legal maximum income should be set at 10 times the legal minimum wage initially. You could then close those scissors over a period with, democratic agreement in society, but it'd be a start. A 10-to-1 differential would be a revolutionary improvement compared to, 162-to-1 in the differential between directors and average workers.
Well, good luck with that. Let me ask you a question about, we've had this discussion several times in the recent past on the show, and particularly when we interviewed somebody from Switzerland.
Right.
And we were talking about direct democracy.
Yeah.
Because was seen as a means of addressing the centralisation that appears to be endemic in not just in the UK but in Scotland too, where
That's right.
everything is run from one place.
That's right.
And we spoke to somebody who very eloquently described how difficult it was to get something done in Tiree because they had to get to someplace in Argyll and persuade somebody in the Argyll who might not know too much about Tiree that there was something there which was worth preserving. And that's largely caused by the extraordinary centralisation. Because if you look at Scotland only has just over 5 million people. You could argue that, the local council should have much more power.
That's right.
And to run their own places, even if the central government didn't approve necessarily of all the stuff that we're doing. What's your view on direct democracy?
We want a maximum devolution of all forms of powers and decision makings in a socialist democracy. What we have at the minute, as you've said rightly, including under the SNP actually, and their Green partners up until recently, there's increased centralisation of every authority. There's centralisation of Police Scotland, centralisation now of a bogus claim to a national care service. We want a national care service that's actually publicly owned, take the profit out of care, whether it be for the elderly, vulnerable children or whoever, disabled and so on. But there's all these centralisation trends, including the fire service as well in Scotland. And we've opposed those every step of the way when it occurred. What I'd like to see would be a situation where there's an overall democratically arrived at plan, but that derives from very localised committees, whether it be in communities, workplaces and so on, which then goes up to more, if you like, city or district or regional level or whatever, and in turn to the national democratic government of Scotland, so that there's a feeding in of grassroots desires and wishes and preferences and priorities. Now, it does have to be coordinated. Like, for example, you couldn't have a national transport network based on localised decision making, goes without saying.
I have some sympathy with what you just said, because when I lived in the States, I was astonished to find out that not only was the local sheriff elected by the local people, but the local dog catcher was too. Now that's direct democracy for you, Richie.
Yes.
Because the US grew out in a very odd way, with a great hostility amongst the founding fathers about centralised government.
Yeah.
I mean, so many of them just hated the whole idea. They didn't want a standing army. They didn't want a bank. They said, this is all the things we fought the British for. And now we're replicating the same nonsense over here. So it's always an issue when it comes to governance about how much democracy is appropriate. And there's always the folks who believe in direct democracy and the folks who say, well, we have to have some centralised coordination. And where you draw the line in all of this, it's not easy.
No, it's not easy. And in some respects, obviously, this is not a cop-out, but people in the future would have to determine the exact detail of the balance. But I suppose as a broad skeleton outline sketch, then if you have national coordination, but there's a devolution of powers and decision-making on what is appropriate. I mean, for example, even in energy, if you had a nationalised energy company transferred over to green production as rapidly as possible, but then you could also have production of green energy at council level and district heating systems at council level or district level within a city, for example. Likewise, we'd argue that in terms of the transport system, a first step should be to take the buses into council ownership and make them part of the national transport service.
Sorry, I just stop you there for two reasons. One is we've run out of time.
Okay.
Equally, we're about to lose our audience because the football has started.
Yes. Indeed.
So let me just very briefly say thank you very much. It's greatly appreciated. And good luck to you in all you do. And thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much, John. I'll continue to fight for socialist change, don't worry. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.